So I guess with these preliminaries out of the way, I think I can now start to introduce you to the first speaker of our seminar. So I explained in this series of seminars, we essentially talk about the cultural change that is needed to make the transition towards open and reproducible science. Of course, as part of this whole trajectory, there are obviously certain things that individual researchers can do, but researchers are in turn part of a larger system or a more encompassing infrastructure with many other stakeholders, funding agencies, universities, but also private companies applying the results of scientific research. But importantly, academic publishers are part of this infrastructure as well. So all of these stakeholders and agents can initiate certain activities that can help to make research more reproducible and more transparent. So the first lecture in this seminar will actually focus on the role of the academic publisher in this context. So it's a great privilege to me to introduce you to our first speaker, Catriona Fennell. She works as a director of publishing services at Elsevier. She has a BSc in biotechnology, obtained at the National University of Galway in Ireland. And after this, she joined Elsevier as a journal manager in 1999. And she has worked in various management roles in STM journals publishing. At the moment, she is mainly responsible for Elsevier's publishing integrity and reproducibility programs. So I guess that the work that she does is related quite directly to the central theme of our seminar series. So I think we can be very fortunate to have Catriona on the program today. So Catriona, could I invite you to start your presentation?
Great, thanks a lot, Peter. Just to explain a little bit more about my context, but also because, of course, our context also sometimes can create biases and limitations of our perspective on things. I work across all different subject areas within Elsevier, so I'm looking at sort of commonalities between different subject areas and infrastructure we can provide that will work for most of them or many of them. My background is originally, very long time ago, biotechnology, biochemistry. So if I think about, for example, reproducibility, that might be sort of what I'm picturing. But of course, it's very clear that it means very different things in different subject areas. But I have worked with journals in all sorts of subject areas. From the journal's perspective, I think Peter already covered, and I'm sure that in the earlier seminars in detail, obviously the challenges of how complex this is, how diverse it is, and that goes the same for journal publishers, that those issues also impact us and how we try to support reproducibility. Just a disclaimer for today, because also the time involved, I'm going to grossly oversimplify this topic. I apologize if you're thinking, this doesn't represent reproducibility in my subject area. You very well could be right, because every subject area could do with its own presentation specifically, I'm sure. And if you think, well, this totally doesn't cover data, well, no, it doesn't. I'm not going to talk about data in that much detail because we have two amazing, much more knowledgeable presenters on that afterwards. The other thing I should mention about the publisher perspective and the journalist perspective, I've heard, I'm not sure who I heard say this, so I apologize, I can't give credit. Someone saying, well, the three big groups that have the power to really influence researcher behavior are the institutes, the funding bodies, and the journals. And I think that's largely true, but I guess what's a bit different with journals is we are very late in the workflow, in the research workflow. And that's not always a big issue. So, you know, for example, with plagiarism, we're not too far from the moment of it happening. But I think with reproducibility, it can really be an issue because sometimes some of the issues are really deep in, you know, early in the design stage, for example. And then by the time you submit to the journal, it's a bit late for the journal to be influencing that, except, you know, obviously the very crude tool of rejecting or asking for revisions. But, you know, as you probably have experienced, I don't think most people don't really appreciate when a journal at revision stage asks you to go off and do another like 6 months to a year of experiments. It's probably not very welcome with researchers. So I'm going to basically slip over the slide because I think it's very clearly established in previous seminars, and others have covered it in detail, that evidence for this being an issue, how widespread an issue it is. There is probably some evidence of variation also between subject areas, but I don't think anyone will dispute it's an issue for every subject area. So from Elsevier's perspective, what we're looking at is really, we're looking at things at scale. We have 2,700 journals. We get about 2.5 million submissions a year in pretty much all subject areas, maybe a bit, less in humanities. We're probably strongest in other areas. So we're trying to look at commonalities. What can we do that is, broadly speaking, supporting researchers, and that will make sense in maybe not every single subject area, but most of them. And then we identified certain issues that we can help to address. Obviously, Peter also discussed it, incentives. It's a huge one, of course, incentives and rewards. And this is somewhere where maybe I think publishers can particularly be of help. Methodology, issues with methodology. I think we can also help there by setting standards. Maybe specifically to publishers, one of our challenges is how can we actually validate reproducibility as part of the peer review process? And that's maybe some challenge for journals. Also issues with statistics, can journals help with that? And of course, the whole question around sharing data and different attitudes to sharing data. So I'll go into these in different levels of detail. I just wanted to mention this, one of the, Brian Nosek and Dorothy Bishop are two of the authors of this paper called the Reproducibility Manifesto. And it's a great paper, also super practical, and sets out, almost a shopping list of things that everybody can do to improve this and that journals can do. So the J here is for journals. And we also have used this paper directly a few years ago to sort of validate our own plans and our own ambitions for what we could do to check, okay, are we on the right track? These are the experts, do our plans make sense? And we, many of these topics you'll see in this list, we've been working on. So when it comes to offering incentives, I could put this in very basic terms, which is, things that we've tried and have been really successful, and things that we've tried that have really failed, because I think also the failures are interesting, and we can all probably learn from that, and certainly Elsevier has tried to. And one of the things we've tried to do is diversify the type of journals and the type of articles we publish, and to not only look at the research paper, but to look at other different types of articles, smaller articles, more specific articles, for example, protocols, software articles, data articles, and data journals. And this is one of the areas that has been really successful. And particularly what we find is that what has been a huge driver of this, particularly, for example, for our main data journal, Data in Brief, is that we build it along the existing workflow. So when someone is submitting, so one of our journals, our traditional journals, let's say, we ask them, would you also be interested in submitting a data paper? And that's a very simple, easy, and also incentivized way to get somebody to share their data, where also then there's a very clear record of it from their perspective. Certain areas that have been a bit less successful, let's say, where we have launched journals, for example, dedicated to negative results. So obviously we know there's an issue with publication bias. I do think, people tend to focus on, the whatever you want to call them, the prestige journals. Some people call them the glamour journals, which I always find interesting, that they only want to publish the most novel, the most exciting research. And, there's truth to that, of course. But there's very few of those journals. Most papers are not published, aren't in those journals, and there's maybe a handful of those journals out of thousands. So I don't think there isn't room for for sound science that isn't necessarily incredibly novel. It doesn't have to be making headlines in the newspaper for it to be worth publishing, of course. When we have launched journals focused on negative results, unfortunately, they really haven't been successful. When we launched them, everyone was very enthusiastic that we had done it. But if you know the whole field of dreams thing, if you build it, they will come. Unfortunately, we built it, but authors didn't really come. The submissions just didn't come, despite a lot of effort from the editors, from marketing. It just didn't seem to click. And when we looked into that further, what we heard from authors was well, you know, it's just not worth the work of writing up these results because, you know, it's not what I want people to really associate with me. Or, you know, we also found, you know, again, on us, probably also a marketing question, having the word negative in the name of the journal even seemed to be something that put people off. So we also learn from these things. Similar with replication studies, I found this topic really interesting, people's attitudes to it. I also spoke to a lot of editors about it. And we thought, okay, having learned from the previous scenario, let's not launch a journal of replication studies. Let's try and get replication studies submitted to our existing journals, because also new journals are always a bit scary for people. So we thought, okay, with our existing journals, we had, I think it was 12 journals in different subject areas that had a call for papers where they explicitly asked for replication studies. One of them in particular, the editor, was very enthusiastic and was really even inviting people and reaching out to people personally. And honestly, very little came in. Even in the journal where the editor was really personally approaching people, I think that journal might have got 10 submissions. Some journals got none, others got a handful. And this was over a long period. This was 6 months or so where we had this call for papers. So we wanted to understand that a bit more, and we interviewed some 125 researchers. And this is just obviously, you know, I could be cherry picking data. This is not scientific research. But some of the attitudes that we heard were things like people thinking, well, you know, why take the time? And people saying, well, journals aren't interested in this anyway, so why would I bother? And that, you know, really publishers need to be much more really driving this kind of these side of submissions. I also heard a very interesting one, which was, and some of the researchers felt, well, editors won't want to publish something if it's like a well-known famous paper and then I fail to replicate it, that's controversial. Which was interesting because when we spoke to editors and we asked that question, they actually said sort of the opposite, which, you know, could also be a problem, where the editors were saying, well, if they have replicated something, that's not that exciting, but if they fail to replicate something, I want to publish that because that's really interesting. So there's also different perceptions on different sides that may not actually, might be assumptions made that may not reflect the reality. This is one of our more successful cases, which is a fairly new journal from Cell Press called Star Protocols, which is, again, trying to offer an incentive for people to really document their protocols in tremendous detail, which, as we know, is obviously extremely important for reproducibility. And this has been doing pretty well. It doesn't hurt. I mean, obviously, you know, we hear a lot of things about the negative effects of having prestige journals, but honestly, one of the positive effects of having a, you know, for example, a Cell Press journal, is that when they do something like this, which is kind of innovative and new, it tends to be more likely to be successful because there's a recognition of the Cell name, basically. So also these journals can help to drive positive behavior. I think I already mentioned our data journal, Data in Brief, and you can see, you know, how this has kind of exploded in the last couple of years. And you can also see, I mean, obviously part of this is just people know it's important, right? And that's, I think, pretty clear, and the awareness is just improving all the time. But also in this case, for example, we were making use of our existing other journals, and I just noticed a typo, which for a publisher is very embarrassing. And we ask when they're revising their paper for their main submission, we remind them, oh, hey, by the way, if you want to, you can also submit your data as a data paper. And you can see that was for like more than 80% of authors who published in the journal. That was one of the reasons. So that's also trying to benefit from the existing infrastructure, which is something we learned from, you know, having previously tried brand new journals, and then brand new journals with an innovative format, sometimes on their own, is just maybe too new for people. It takes a long time to move. So I mentioned one of the other challenges, and this is maybe specific to journals and somewhere where journals can help, is how can the peer review process better validate reproducibility? And you could sort of divide this into two issues, but the first one I won't go into that much detail today. I mean, the core is, right, of course, you want peer review to detect fraud, right? So that's obviously sort of a basic thing. And not an easy thing to do, but very, very basic. But of course, you know, papers not being reproduced is almost never because of fraud. It's a tiny percentage, right? Most of the time it's nothing to do with fraud. So it's much broader than just that. What we are seeing is almost this kind of explosion of AI. Some of it, I'm sure you know, StatCheck, of course, from Tilburg University, which can help in the peer review process. Some of our journals have been using, in psychology, have been using StatCheck now for a couple of years already, but also tools around checking ethics statements, checking images, checking for plagiarism. And I think the ones that particularly we're excited about now, the newer tools that have a lot of potential, are also checking for image fraud, image duplication, and so on. And that's a really important addition to our existing tools. And then we have some really, innovative, well, by now, I guess this is 5 years old, so it's fairly established, but a really interesting approach to really changing the whole almost concept of how peer review is handled. And that's one example is registered reports, which was created by Chris Chambers, originally in Cortex, is now with, I think, 150 journals altogether. Not all Elsevier journals, is much broader than Elsevier by now. And this is a really interesting approach. Probably Dorothy or Brian probably also mentioned it, where basically you submit the paper before you've actually got your results. So you're submitting your protocol, which means you're committed, your hypothesis, you're committed to how you're going to conduct your research. And then in principle, so the journal then accepts it in principle. So this really, helps also to deal with this thing of publication bias, right? We've agreed we're going to publish it no matter what you find. And what we find is that since we've launched this, so this is the first journal to launch it, was Cortex. This is Chris Chambers from, I believe he's still in Cardiff. That was, even 2013, wow. And so far this journal, the journal, we've published about 50 of them. Now, there's been a fantastic reaction to registered reports. I personally find it really exciting. I've always found it, like, Chris Chambers is super passionate about it. He's really an ambassador for it. But we're not seeing huge amounts of uptake. And I think part of that is it's quite a dramatic change. I think some authors are concerned about it in terms of like being tied in. Some people even think, and I don't agree with this at all, but there's some perception of it like, well, it's anti sort of innovation, which I don't agree with. So we're seeing it more successful in psychology and social sciences. But I think we do need to think about that. Like, this is so clearly, if you hear about registered reports, it just clearly makes so much sense as to, why there isn't more uptake. Another approach is slightly less dramatic change, I suppose, is results masked review, where the results are there, but you submit to the journal without the results first. And that version is reviewed. And again, similar, where the decision is made without having seen the results. But it's a bit further in the workflow, as that the study has already been done at that stage. And again, really positive reaction. People love it and are really positive about it. But this is all at the moment still the author's choice. It's not mandatory. And we're not seeing, again, massive uptake. Now, we keep working on these things. Sometimes change takes some time. Sometimes you're too early in a way, right, that you need to kind of catch a certain wave and things take off later. So we still keep working on these things. I'm just going to quickly look at time because I don't want to go over my slot. So the other area, I won't go into too much detail, but how journals can encourage researchers to be more transparent in the methodology. And one of the approaches that we have used has been originally started with Cell Press, where they launched something called STAR, and you might notice the journal they launched, STAR Methods is the same name, around structured, transparent, accessible reporting. Now, because it's Cell Press, originally this was quite specific to sort of molecular biology type area, like very focused on antibodies, cell lines, those sort of details. But we have also taken many elements of this and implemented them for other journals and other subject areas as well. And the idea is, really that the level of detail should be there, that if you come back to your own paper in 5 years or someone else comes to your paper, that they really can replicate the work because the details are there in the methods. And some of that includes like very specific things like you know, exactly the antibody name being exactly right and having the catalog number of the antibody. And, you know, that is the devil in the detail stuff that, you know, can make the difference with reproducibility. I won't talk that much about data because, of course, we have two far more knowledgeable speakers talking about data. But from Elsevier's perspective, of course, what we're looking at here is really trying to look at the whole workflow. As I said, we're late in the workflow, right? You know, I mean, it's a bit late in the game if you're submitting your paper, if, you know, your data wasn't already well structured and you didn't design, you know, the data collection in a certain way for us to then be imposing certain standards. But so that's the journal side, but Elsevier also is involved. It has some products that are sort of earlier in the workflow, like, for example, HiveBench, which is sort of like electric lab books, but also Mendeley data where people can freely deposit data. And that allows us to do a few things. And one of the things that allows us to do, you know, on a very practical level in terms of like integrating systems, is it allows us to make it very easy for authors to deposit their data while they're in the workflow, while they're submitting their paper. And that in itself is very powerful. And we know there are all sorts of reasons for people, you know, sharing their data or feeling ready to share their data. And there can be real, you know, very serious issues like patient privacy and so on. But an element of it is also just making it really easy for people. And what we learned was when we integrated data sharing really into the submission workflow, is we saw this big increase in data sharing. And we hadn't really changed our policies. So we had already had policies around data sharing. It wasn't that we suddenly overnight made it mandatory for 1,000 journals. We just made it easy for people. Okay, we were encouraging it with our policies, but the act of just making it really easy was pretty powerful. And I think that's somewhere where you can see, you know, because obviously there are, for right or for wrong, a lot of incentives to submit articles and get published. You can also make use of that and make use of that process to encourage behaviors that are very positive and, you know, often still making it optional. So just to recap a bit, I didn't obviously go into some of these topics in detail for time reasons, but from the publisher's perspective, the sort of themes of what we're looking at are basically, how can we help provide the right incentives? How can we help encourage researchers to share their data? I should also mention there's a lot of variability there per subject area. We do have subject areas where this is very mature, like economics, computer science, parts of earth science, where it's already completely normal to share data and has been for, in some case, you know, a decade. And then we have other subject areas like perhaps medicine, where people are much more reticent, often because of patient privacy. I talked about methods and how we try to encourage authors to really report their methods in much more granular detail than before. The challenges of validation, how we try to validate reproducibility. I didn't really talk about statistics because for lack of time. And also it's probably one of the areas we're not that mature in yet, honestly. And we are looking at very expanding some of these tools like StatCheck, StatReviewer, but also looking at, well, how can we help perhaps improve with education in this area? So thank you very much for giving me the time. And I wanted to thank some of my colleagues, but also very much Marcus Manaf, one of the authors of the Reproducibility Manifesto, which for us has been a really useful benchmark. And of course, our editors. Absolutely nothing changes in journals or improves without editors. And they're massively inspiring and continuously willing to change with us, which is incredibly important.
Yes, thank you for a very informative, very insightful talk. I think this was a really clear explanation of some of the ways in which academic publishers can, well, enable and facilitate this shift towards open science. I think your focus on creating incentives was also really helpful. There have been a number of questions. So at the beginning of your talk, you talked about some of your less successful experiments, and one of these was a negative results journal. So you mentioned that researchers don't want to be associated with negative results journals. So you built the system, but the researchers didn't come. So do you think that this attitude will change when pre-registered reports, so pre-registrations of questions and methods become more common? You also refer to pre-registrations. So when you pre-register a study, you can of course never know beforehand whether your study will produce a null result or a positive result. So do you think that this perception of null results or of negative results will also change as pre-registrations become more widespread?
Yeah, I think so. And as I said, I love the pre-registration. The whole concept of it is just great. And I mean, it kind of forces everyone to stay honest, right? But that's also very much on the reviewers and the editor, that they really have to judge the research on the merits of the idea and the protocol. So I really hope that will help. As I said, we're not seeing, because at the moment registered reports, I think probably any journal that's doing it, it's still optional. And we're not seeing huge uptake. It's not like every article that's submitted to that journal follows that process. I think it's quite a challenge for probably everyone involved, but I mean, we have journals where the editors are 100% behind it, but I think also for the authors, it's quite a challenge, right? It's quite confronting to work in that very different way. I also have to say that one of our learnings from those journals was that it may have been a mistake this is some time ago now, so maybe things would have changed. At the time, for example, they were open access journals, they were new journals with no sort of track record. And a new journal is always a risk. Every publisher will tell you, launching a new journal, the first 5 years is always heavy lifting to sort of get the name out there and get people aware of the journal. So that's why we also started doing things more in combination with existing journals, because maybe the whole journal being negative results was also part of the problem. Whereas if it's an existing journal with combination of different types of content, then sort of it normalizes things, right? I think maybe we made a mistake of making it too specialized.
Thank you. And also have a question about data. As you mentioned, we'll talk more specifically about data in some of the later lectures today. But perhaps we can, for now, focus on the role of the publisher. So you talked about data journals. Can you perhaps say something about the review process for data? So researchers are, of course, encouraged to make their data available and reusable, but making sure that data can generally be reused is, of course, very difficult. Data may be unstructured or it may be structured inconsistently. Data may not always be machine readable. So how should publishers deal with this? So whose responsibility should it be to evaluate the quality and the reusability of the data, or even check things such as compliance with the FAIR principles?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And what we see there also is so much variation between subject areas, because, I mean, of course, data, I mean, we're saying data, but of course we also mean code, right? And and what we see in some subject areas, this is already happening. Several of our economics journals have mandatory replication policies where this has to be checked during the process, and if it can't be verified, then your paper doesn't get published, basically. So that's already there in some areas, and other areas still have further to come. I mean, I think with the data journals, because they're dedicated to that one topic, therefore the editors and the reviewers are also really trained on these validation processes. With the non-data journals, I mean, honestly, I think almost every editor you will ask will say their number one biggest challenge is finding reviewers. And that's before you start asking them to look at the data. That's looking at the paper. Now, obviously, there are many, many reasons for that. And some of them, obviously, publishers are responsible for. And there's been an explosion of journals, which means people, as you know, are getting bombarded with invitations. So asking reviewers to go that step further and then also take steps to really go in and validate the data. At scale, I think we're going to have to really think about what that will take. As I said, in some subject areas, it already happens and it's just a given. But really across all subject areas and really doing that for, 500,000 papers a year, that's going to take quite a change in our relationship with reviewers, I think.
Yeah, I think I agree. Yeah, I'm afraid we don't have time for many more questions. I guess there's a bit of a shame. Perhaps we would also be willing to answer questions through mail or some other channel. But thank you again for a really interesting lecture and for your answers. So at this point, we need to move on to our next speaker.